Hello everyone, welcome to Lab 7. In Lab 7 we're going to discuss lymphatic system. Quote I chose for this one was, "Some day is not a day of the week." Good advice for us all to remember sometimes. So what I always like to do is kind of start everything off with this kind of background introduction of basically what is it that this system that we're looking at does. Now remember, this is for lab, so we're going to be focusing on not as much detail as we would for a lecture, but these are good foundations for the lecture to understand kind of what's going on. Now, first off, lymphatic system, we really should have a good idea that this is a major thing involved in the immune system, immunity. Because lymphatics plays a major role in fighting against pathogens. Pathogens are things that can make us sick. For example, viruses, bacteria, stuff like that. Now, what we will also see, and if you guys remember back, if we look at chapter 21, what we're going to see in chapter 21 lecture is how capillaries functioned. And what I showed you in my chapter 21 lecture when we drew it out and we were showing how the high pressures of capillaries at the end of arterioles will push fluids out, and then the lower pressures at the end of the capillary bed near the venules causes fluids to go back in. But we said there is about 10% that just does not enter the capillary bed, and that 10% of the fluid will stay there in the interstitial fluid. Well, what happens? Why does that not accumulate? It's because the lymphatic system picks it up. It helps us recycle that fluid, any nutrients that fluid is holding that was lost at the capillary bed. It got filtered, did not get reabsorbed, because usually around about 10% does not. And then we'll send it back to the venous system. And I'll show you a little bit about how that happens in a good diagram that we have later on. Now remember, this is just lab, so we focus mostly on anatomy, but we will discuss some things. Now, we will see four major kind of components and compositions to our lymphatic system that we really are going to be looking at and kind of understanding. And the first thing is going to be the fluid that is transported by the lymphatic system, and that is lymph. Lymph is very much like interstitial fluid, and we shouldn't be surprised by that, because we now understand from chapter 21 that about 10% of the fluid that you lost at capillary beds are picked up by the lymphatics. So this is why it will be pale yellow. It's going to have that bilirubin in it. Sorry, not biliverdin. And it's also going to be very chemically similar to interstitial fluid because of that as well. So it's going to have some of the same pigment degradation breakdown, hemoglobin breakdown molecules that we learn about in the blood chapter. Lymphatic vessels, we also call them lymphatics. This is just the tubes that carry lymph throughout the body. There are smaller lymphatics, there are bigger lymphatics, superficial ones and deep ones, etc. And then we look at various things like your lymphoid tissues and organs. Now, one of the big things when we talk about things like that is such things as the spleen, your tonsils, your thymus, appendix, bone marrow, things like that, which are also part of that. So let's talk about the red bone marrow, because we know that red bone marrow is the site of blood cell production. And we know that blood cells, there are many of them, and we know one subtype of blood cell is a lymphocyte. Lymphocyte, remember, B cells, T cells, natural killer cells. Lymphocytes, they are made in red bone marrow, the site of blood cell production, primary blood cell production. I may have mentioned in a lecture, I was talking to my students before, that it was thought that was the only place. We have evidence to suggest that's not always true, but I would be safe to say that is the primary site of all blood cell production. Some evidence suggests the lungs also are producing active blood cells. The one thing that we want to talk about is that these little lymphatic vessels, imagine that in the spaces between tissues and cells found throughout our entire body, with a few exceptions, like the central nervous system doesn't use it. Remember, they have like the microglia and things like that. The lymphatic system, we refer to it as. The spleen pulp, the pulp of the spleen doesn't have it. The bone marrow doesn't have it, and the cornea doesn't have it. But it's found pretty much everywhere, most of the body. And what happens is, if something that leaks out of a capillary, that's a blood capillary, like right here are blood capillaries, let's say a protein leaked out, it's going to grab it up and hope to return it back to the blood. Now, another thing, I always like to say that lymphatic capillaries are like the Hotel California. If you remember that song by the Eagles, the Hotel California, you can check in anytime you like, but you can never leave. The Hotel California, this is what your lymphatic capillaries are like. It is a structure that ensures that if interstitial fluid enters it, it doesn't go back out. And so this permits flow in but not flow out to ensure its return. Now, they are quite a bit larger in diameter. If we look at a cross-section of a typical blood capillary here, and then we look here at the diameter of that, and here side-by-side comparison, capillaries to lymphatic capillaries are bigger, typically larger, at least a little bit. Now, another weird thing, if you look here, we have arterioles and venules, and the capillaries are continuous to arterioles and venules. There is a continual loop. Blood is in a blood vessel unless we're bleeding. And so, but lymphatic capillaries, they're not continuous. They just end. They have what we call, they end blindly. One might say they begin blindly even there. They just do not have a continual set of tubes. They're not continuous with other vessels. And then they will unite after an area that they are spread out across, will unite with others to make larger vessels, lymphatic vessels or lymphatics. And then those lymphatic vessels can unite into even larger lymphatic vessels, or so-called lymphatic trunks, things like that, and then lymphatic ducts as well. So as we talk about them, if I do a direct comparison of a lymphatic vessel to a vein, now lymphatic vessels and veins, they tend to run alongside each other with the other vascular organ, the artery. And what we're going to see is they are much like veins. Now, the resemblance is a little bit different. They both have valves and they're both relatively thin-walled. Now, lymphatic vessels are actually thinner-walled and have more valves. Now, we know those valves are for one-way flow. When fluid passes through that valve and then tries to pass back, it prevents that backflow. That is indicative of having valves, is indicative of low pressure and preventing backflow. So a lot of times, these things are very low pressure, okay? Now, they'll come together into the two very large lymphatic ducts. And these two large lymphatic ducts are being fed by all these lymphatic capillaries. Lymphatic capillaries are basically draining lymph from certain parts of the body. They're uniting with lymphatic vessels. The lymphatic vessels eventually will go into a lymphatic duct, and they drain into venous system. Now, the lymphatic ducts usually go right around the subclavian veins, either at the upper part or a little bit lower part around there. Usually around the subclavian veins, there might be some variation, but we're safe to say very close. There are variations in this, but very close to subclavian veins. I've seen them on brachiocephalic veins, things like that. Now, the two of them, the right lymphatic duct, as its name implies, it's draining lymph from the right side of the body. But it is only right side of the body above the diaphragm. So this light green area right here is where it is receiving lymph from. So imagine all the lymphatic capillaries are here and they're bringing it, and it's only the right side of the body above the diaphragm, which will be markated here. Now the thoracic duct gets all the rest. You're going to get the left side of the body above diaphragm and the entire lower half of the body. Now, what happens, and I'm going to show you a diagram next where you can see these and the cisternocyle, which cisternocyle is the sac at the bottom. Not everybody has a cisternocyle. I know that there is a number of people who don't have them, but majority of people, to the best of my knowledge, have cisternocyle. And the number that was always rattling around my head may not be right, so I'm not going to say it, but I do know that there are people who, of course, don't have them as an anatomical anomaly. I used to know those numbers a little bit better when I was in school. Now, what's going to happen is, as you can see, they're going to be going around your subclavian veins, either usually upper here. I have seen them on brachiocephalic veins, things like that, but typically right around here. And our right lymphatic duct is going to be receiving all the lymph from the area that is above the diaphragm on the right side of the body. The rest of it is the thoracic duct is receiving all the rest of that lymph. And eventually what's going to happen is that lymph comes in, it drains into the venous system. And you'll actually find it between the azygous and hemiazygous veins here at the posterior mediastinum, also nearby the esophagus. As I always used to say, it was a duct between two gooses, the azygoos and the esophagus, when I was a student, to learn its anatomical location where you would find it in posterior mediastinum. Now, the cisternocyle at the bottom. Now, this is a diagram I would use, of course, on an exam to show those three structures. And what I've done is removed all superfluous structures and only labeling those in which we are required to know for our laboratories. We have a very specific list of structures that we cover, and that's just the way I handle mine. Now, as we look at some other tissues, these lymphoid tissues, remember we're dealing with tissues that are associated to lymphatic system. Now, they are usually some sort of connective tissue, loose connective tissue like reticular connective tissue, and there's lymphocytes. Okay, so basically what you're really going to be dealing with is some organ tissue, set of tissues, usually something like reticular, who is going to contain in them lymphocytes, B cells, T cells, natural killer cells present. Now, one of these is called a lymphatic nodule, sometimes also called lymphatic follicles. And when you're dealing with lymphatic follicles or lymph nodules, your lymphoid nodules, one of the important things is they are not surrounded by a capsule. These are fairly large lymphoid tissues, but there's no capsule. Now, that means they can swell quite large and occlude areas like occlude the area leading to the pharynx. Things like that, as when it comes to your tonsils. Now, they contain an area called a germinal center, and that's where lymphocytes are actively dividing. Active dividing lymphocytes will be there. The lymphocyte cells are dividing. Now, one of the things I like to oftentimes think about when I discuss lymphoid tissues, one of the things, and when it comes to lymphatics, as we said, they are there to help us fight infectious agents, things that might make us very sick. Now, infectious agents are found in a lot of things, especially as I'm recording this. This is like the very first normal semester. I'm teaching summer semester as I record this, and this is the first semester because I'm fully vaccinated. I am able to go onto campus without a mask. And what's been very odd is throughout the entire year and a half, roughly, of COVID, I did not get a single anything. I did not get a sniffle. I didn't get a cold or anything. And within maybe like 2 weeks of actually there, I started getting some things like drainage and scratchy throat, which probably is just allergens because we live in one of the allergy capitals of the world here in Tennessee, in the United States. So it's a very bad allergy area. But we probably have a good idea that air we breathe contains pathogens. The food we eat contains pathogens. So there's loads of things. The air we breathe and the food we eat, the liquids we drink can contain pathogens. Now, I always like to say, so what we do is with lymphatic tissues, lymphoid tissues, is we strategically place it to fight invaders. It's kind of like if you're playing, like when I was a young guy, there was a game, which people playing now, and it's like mobile. I don't know if it's really how big, it's kind of gone out of the way, I think. But I used to really be in a Command and Conquer. We used to play a lot of Command and Conquer. And we know there were just certain places you always wanted to put defenses because you knew the other people were going to attack you, because that's a very common tactic. And so you wouldn't put a defense over someplace no one could ever get to, or at least very much. So you always want to defend areas where you're weak. Well, the mucosa of the body, what do? These are mucous membranes that line areas that are open to the world. So a mucosa, for example, in our nasal cavity, in our oral cavity mucosas. You have mucosa through a lot of places. Now, we have lymphoid tissues associated to these throughout mucous membranes called mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues. We lovingly call this MALT. If the MALT is in the gut, we call it GALT. If it's in the bronchus, we call it BALT. If it's in the nasal cavity, we call it NALT. GALT, BALT, NALT, these are all types of mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues. And again, strategically placed to fight invaders. It's kind of like, okay, I know I want to protect this resource from somebody who may try to destroy it to keep me from having it, or they'll come and steal it so they can have it and I don't. Like in a defending kind of video game, like you might play, which people still play some of these, but Command and Conquer was the classic that I grew up with. So as we think about that, that's kind of how I think. I always think about the immune system as always like fighting a war, very combative. We're in a hostile environment always. There's things around us all the time that can make us sick, and you want to put your defense places in anywhere that things could get in. It's like, oh, it's we got this little thing here that can place we can get in, and that's a lot of the avenues where you get sick from is breathing something in, like an airborne virus, like the flu, or of course COVID, SARS-CoV-2, and other things like that. Food, like foodborne pathogens. Now there's other ways, of course, touching it, then touching a mucosa, touching your eyes, touching your nose, touching your mouth. Now, we have something called pyres patches, which I never called it that. That was not a term I ever used. I always use aggregated lymphoid nodules. They also call them pyres patches. But these are in the small intestines. We'll talk about them, that they're basically there, that if any bacteria from the large intestine gets into the small intestine, this can help us fight those bacteria from spreading there who may be harmful. And right here you could see the germinal center of a lymphoid tissue. So for a lot of inflammatory diseases, it is the connective tissue under the epithelium that is largely responsible for that. And you can see some of these things here, kind of where some of the inflammatory bowel disease issues may come about as well. So it's important to know these things. Now, one thing I want to talk about, in lecture, you're going to hear me call this the Dyers ring, the tonsils. And I always have to crack a joke in my labs that they use the picture of the children of the corn here to do that. So I'm going to do it here as well. One of the things, I always tend, when I'm recording it ahead of time and I don't have an audience, I tend to not be as funny. I don't tend to joke as much. I always like to make jokes in class, kind of help my students. So that is always one they like. But something I tend to lose when I don't have an audience in front of me and I'm recording down in my den. But always this kind of looks like some creepy children of the corn. So we have what's called tonsils. And these are lymphoid nodules that are in the pharynx. You have upper one here called the pharyngeal tonsil, sometimes called the adenoid. Then on the left and right side of coming from the oral cavity in is the palatine tonsils, which there are two, left and right, and then a left and right lingual tonsil. Now, what happens is your pharyngeal tonsils at the top, then they're under the hard palate, under the palate. You would see these are your tonsils if you've had tonsillectomy. That's one they're probably working on here, is the palatine tonsil, which there's two. And because they're left and right, they can swell so much they occlude the airway and make it hard to swallow. We call that kissing tonsils. And then your pharyngeal tonsil, your lingual tonsil down here. Now, I, in lecture, call this the Wall-Dyer's ring. And why I call it a Wall-Dyer's ring is, and that's how you will hear me call it Wall-Dyer's ring, is that you will find one at the top, two on either side, and two at the bottom. And I always like to call this the pentagon of the pharynx. We all know that the pentagon is a major area for the American Defense Department, things like that. So you have at the top here your adenoid, the upper one, the adenoid or pharyngeal tonsil. Then we have our two palatine, and then we have our two linguals at the bottom. And this forms a ring we call the Wall-Dyer's ring. In lecture, that's what you'll hear me call it, is Wall-Dyer's ring. It's that'll be a thing you'll hear me call it anyway as well. But they form this kind of structure. And it is something rather important to understand there is that this guards the area where a lot of food or respiratory food, drink, and inhaled pathogens can go. Frequently, if they're constantly getting inflamed, we remove them. The pharyngeal tonsil and the palatine tonsil specifically, adenoidectomy and a typical tonsillectomy. And these are removed to make it easier to breathe and to eat and swallow food as well. Especially the two palatines. It occludes the airway, causes kissing tonsils. Now, right now, and I'm going to say that this needs to be updated in our notes. Our book hasn't caught up with most recent medical knowledge, but we know it contains a bunch of lymphoid nodules. Now, the appendix, your vermiform appendix or appendix. Now, one of the things I want to mention about it, we do know a little bit more now. One of the things we do know is it acts as a reservoir for normal flora, gut bacteria, enteric bacteria. So if you go on antibiotics and they get wiped out, they can be held in the appendix and come out and repopulate the gut. One of the things that can happen. This is in the large intestine, and there's a lot of lymphoid nodules. Now, having it removed is not going to have like severe suppression of immune functions. It wouldn't be like if you lost some other more important organs. But it is an organ that your body does use. Basically, I've read the course. We know that it holds and acts as a reservoir for normal flora, among some things there that it might do as well. The suspect would be that it was once upon a time an extension of the cecum to help ferment plant material back when we were more herbivorous. Now let's talk about lymph nodes. A very important structure is a lymph node. You have many of them. Now lymph nodes are surrounded by a capsule, so they can swell. They tend to not swell as large as something like a lymphoid nodule would. But lymph nodes are surrounded by a capsule, which is dense connective tissues, like dense irregular connective tissue and other tissues. Now, lymph nodes, for example, are very small. They're all along lymphatic vessels, at least in certain areas. They cluster, like the neck, the armpit, the groin, around the gut, things like that. Now, their outer covering of connective tissues that has a lot of collagen in it is called the capsule. The capsule, the outer covering, will internalize, will extend inward to form little compartments called the trabeculae. Trabeculae are the collagen bundles that come from the capsule inside, and we're going to see that it makes components, little compartments rather. Now we're going to see that underneath this is a cortex. There's an outer cortex and a deep cortex. Now, the outer cortex is actually dominated by B cells, while the deep cortex is dominated by the T cells. Now, inside the core, sometimes called medullary core or medulla, you will hear me say, because in our notes it says medullary core. I'm pretty sure this image, medullary cord actually, medullary core. The medulla is deep inside. Now, I really wish it did a better job of that. There's a few things that I have, some kind of minor things that we do with our labs, but we try to be very consistent amongst lab because we have so many different lab sections compared to lecture. Now, this is a word you're going to hear a lot, is hilum. You'll hear hilum of a lymph node, and we'll hear it in other organs as well. But a hilum, if you have an organ, there's an indentation. You'll have blood vessels, nerves, and the like, other tubes, like in this case, lymph. You have blood vessels, you have nerves that are there attached to the lymph node. Now, there will be two kinds of lymphatic vessels or lymphatics that come and go from this. The ones that come or arrive, carry lymph to a lymph node, is called afferent. Afferent arrives carrying lymph towards the lymph node. Efferent exits, carries away from lymph nodes. Okay? Now, as we look at this, you may notice here we can actually have lymphatic vessels, and we have clusters of various lymph nodes there nearby it. And one of the things we will notice is there's the outer capsule collagen fibers, which will bundle inwards, forming these internal structures called trabeculae. Now, that surrounds us into these compartments of the trabeculae. Now, the trabeculae's compartments that it forms, that is surrounding your cortex. Now, the cortex itself, normally what we used to always like to do is you have a superficial and a deep cortex. The superficial cortex and a deep cortex. The deeper cortex, there's a dotted line missing here to really show the medulla is right in here. And I'm going to have to replace this image to get that dotted line back. I used to have one that had two dotted lines on it. It was part of the art. This one just doesn't have it. And then you will see your efferent vessel exiting and the afferent vessels coming in. One of the ways you can tell this is afferent vessel is the direction the valves go. All right, and I don't think I missed anything there. Now, the mediastinum, in the mediastinum, you will find a thymus gland. The thymus, we talk about in the endocrine system. We said it makes thymosins in the endocrine system. And then in a lecture, I'm going to talk about how that makes us immunocompetent, allows us to make a proper immune defense. I always like to say the thymus is like the general, where you don't see the high-ranking general going out and fighting on the battlefield. They send the soldiers out to fight, and the general stays back. And in this case, this is what the thymus, he does not directly fight. He basically educates and trains soldiers, T cells, to fight. He will be pink in color. There will be a cortex and a medulla, which in lecture I will talk about how cells come into the thymus, they come into the cortex, they go to the medulla, then they leave for peripheral tissues, things like that. Now, the thymus is really just above the heart here, behind the sternum, located in the mediastinum. All right, last few things we want to talk about is our spleen, the last thing. And we're going to see the spleen has a diaphragmatic surface, which this is the surface that really is up against the diaphragm. So because of this, it's smooth and in the shape of the diaphragm. It conforms to the diaphragm's internal structure because it's up against it. The visceral surface has to conform to the visceral organs, stomach, and kidney. So it's going to be more indented. There will be a hilum here. Now, a hilum, we said, is basically an indentation where blood vessels and other tubes may enter. So blood vessels and lymphatic vessels come into the spleen through these. Now, What is attached to the hilum is a splenic artery and vein coming and going. That's what brings in the oxygen, the arteries bringing in the oxygen and the nutrients, the vein taking out the waste. Now, splenic vein can have fluid. We'll talk about, I talked about this actually in the vein section about splenomegaly and portal caval hypertension, where blood may go down the splenic vein and then swell up the spleen, causing splenomegaly. You can also have that, of course, happen with Epstein-Barr virus. Now, red pulp is the part of the pulp found in the spleen that has a very high quantity of red blood cells, whereas white pulp is dominated by lymphocytes, which, remember, lymphocytes are a type of white blood cell. Remember, with white blood cells, it's never let monkeys eat bananas, and the lymphocytes are the second most abundant of the white blood cells. So never let monkeys eat bananas is the differential count order. Neutrophils, lymphocytes, never let monkeys eat bananas. Monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Never let monkeys eat bananas. And we use that in our lecture. Now, when we look, you are looking at the side here, the visceral surface, where you can see where the stomach and the kidney would conform to it. The hilum is where the splenic artery and vein will be, and then there will be some other lymphatic vessels that will be coming in as well. There is white pulp that's dominated by white blood cells. There's red pulp dominated by red blood cells, things like that, but that's not the only vessels, of course, are the only things you will find there. All right. What I do is I call it a study guide. These are all the things you'll need to know. Remember, diagrammatically, these are the diagrams I will use for the test, and I put the structure that you need to know, and then just here's all the terms to go through. So this concludes my lab on, this is the only lab that really, that and the reproductive system is the only two labs we do. We do not use models for. Specifically, this one we only have one model. Repro, we had more, but that was during the height of COVID. And I might be able to try to go in and get, but I'm going to use diagrams for that one as well. I've already got the exam made, and I don't have time to change it. But we will be looking at some new models that I'll be bringing in and redoing videos for the labs in the future. And then eventually we'll change some things some more for my labs. So guys, thank you so much. I hope you find these recordings useful. If you are watching this on my YouTube channel and you haven't given me a subscription, please go ahead and do. Don't forget to comment, like, and let me know what you might like to see. So guys, thank you, and this concludes my lab on the lymphatic system.